Pablo Ruiz Picasso was born in 1881 and died in 1973. He's considered one of the great geniuses in the history of art. His painting, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, the Young Ladies of Avignon Street, the street part is understood, was finished in 1907. It is considered to be the first true 20th century painting to conclusively and finally reject the concept of painting as an extension of a realistic three-dimensional space. In other words, it rejects the Renaissance concept of the painting as a window on reality. In terms of the subject, we have nudes. Nudes have a long tradition in Western art and Western painting as subjects, but these nudes refute all that had been sacred in Western figural aesthetics, since the nude, one might say, was invented by the Greeks as the ideal type in the 5th century. Although it was not publicly exhibited for 30 years after it was painted, this painting, which Picasso kept in his studio, had a profound effect on those artists and critics who saw it in Paris, beginning in 1907. It is a work that begins the movement in the 20th century called Cubism. The title of the work was probably given by a poet friend of Picasso. As I said, it means Young Ladies of Avignon Street, making reference to a famous street and brothel in Barcelona. The earliest preliminary sketches suggest that Picasso, and I have an image. Barcelona is the most wonderful city. This is Avignon Street. So this was a red light district in Picasso's time. The earliest preliminary sketches suggest that Picasso had intended to paint an allegory of transitory life. But eventually all of the kind of allegorical and symbolic and anecdotal details were eliminated, including, it would seem, his intention to show two clothed men in the brothel. You can see them in an early sketch here, one on the left standing, one on the right, who may be seated. He also included a still life in the front and a tabletop, and some remnants of a still life, and if you want to read it, of a tabletop remain in the lower part of the canvas in the foreground. Picasso made at least 31 preliminary sketches in charcoal, pencil, pastel, watercolor, and oil. It was a work that he approached very seriously. He understood it was to be a major work at this point in its career. The originality of Les Demoiselles d'Avignon is certainly undeniable. It is an extraordinary work. Here's another sketch which he made, which is getting even closer to what will become the final composition for the work. But as original as Les Demoiselles d'Avignon is, and we're going to be talking about its originality, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in the continuum of modern art that we now have some sense of. It was inspired by earlier tradition, one might say. In fact, you could start by saying that for Picasso, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon is a sort of classic demonstration piece, yes? Unifying a number of figures, some partially draped, some nude, different poses within a setting. So we could even think of one of its sources as the work of Thomas Couture, The Romans of the Decadence. Remember, Thomas Couture was Manet's teacher. But in terms of more direct inspiration, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon reflects on Picasso's great interest in Cézanne and in Cézanne's late bathers. Cézanne did a series of late bathers. Remember, we looked at the Philadelphia bathers, probably the largest of the group. This is on the right is called the Five Bathers. It dates between 1885 and 87. And it's a work in a kind of casual moment in time, the different poses, a representation of female figures in a very delimited setting. It's the kind of work that would have more directly inspired Picasso's composition. He may also very well have been inspired by Henri Matisse. You remember, who had become notorious in 1905 by being called a fauvist. This is a work called Le Joie de Vivre, or The Love of Life, from 1906 by Matisse. I actually brought this up to you in terms of our looking at Kandinsky, you remember. So Matisse is extremely important as far as the oeuvre of these major artists now in the early 20th century. And in this case, it's, again, the kind of casualness, the different poses, and the color. Because, as I mentioned already, Matisse is a brilliant colorist, and Picasso is perhaps looking at that as well. Les Demoiselles d'Avignon also relies to a great extent in its imagery on some very untraditional sources. In respect to the time period, the early 20th century, it's unusual that Picasso would be looking, for instance, at Egyptian art, of which there was a great deal in the Louvre. But one of the things about traditional Egyptian wall paintings from tombs, such as this one that I show you on the right-hand side, is the way the Egyptian artists manipulated the body to show you. Remember, if you've taken the History of Art 1A, we typically understand that what the Egyptians are doing is trying to show you the most characteristic parts of the body by turning the body like this, right? No one stands like this. This hurts. But this is the way the Egyptian figures are represented, so that we can see as much of them as possible, the fullness of the torso, both of the legs. If the figure was standing like this, then we'd be missing a whole half of the body. But we move them out, we get the implications of movement, and we see the figure more fully. So if you think about it, in some ways, we're seeing that in Picasso as well. He had also been looking at other sources, the post-impressionists, German expressionism. There are a number of important sources for him. The two central figures are perhaps the most realistic. Now, let me back up here just so you can remind yourself of the two central figures. If you look at them, and then you look at the other women, the three other women, you can see that the three other women have become, at least in terms of their heads and faces, much more abstract. So if we look at those two central figures, we see they have these ovoid faces, large staring eyes, and it becomes quite clear that Picasso is making reference to Iberian sculpture. Now, Iberia is a name, a Roman name for Spain, and I'm going to talk about Picasso's upbringing after we talk about this painting. But this is art of the Iberian Peninsula, pre-Roman Spanish art. A whole group of so-called Iberian sculptures were exhibited at the Louvre in a large exhibition in 1906. And one can imagine that Picasso felt a kind of closeness and affinity to this sculpture because he is a Spaniard, and this is very early Spanish art. He adapted the ovoid shape, the flat frontal planes, the sharply arched brow, and the thin lips to the features of these two central female figures, although the hairstyles are slightly more modernized, or certainly different. The most dramatically distorted forms are the faces of the two figures all the way to the right in Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. The heads of these two women are extraordinarily abstract, are extraordinarily distorted, with long noses, very sculpturesque, but also flattened, if it's possible to be both. Flat ridges running down the center of the noses, lines defining certain parts of the face, the cheekbones, the chin, the forehead. We can see that in both of the ways that he represents these figures. And they are strikingly abstract. And that abstraction relates to the fact that Picasso had specifically been looking at West African sculpture. On the left-hand side, for instance, I am showing you a Dan mask from the Ivory Coast and or Liberia. Now, the Dan are the group of people, the society, the individuals who wore this mask who belonged to a specific group, were the Mande culture. And I think one of the first points I want to make about African sculpture, although we did talk about it already, remember it's already something that's been incorporated into the visual experience of German expressionist artists in the early 20th century, is that African sculpture within African tribal tradition is very conservative. And this is something I mentioned before when we looked at German expressionist art. So that what you see is something that has been a type represented over and over again within the particular tribal culture, within the specific ethnic group. And it doesn't change. You're not expected to be unique or create something new. And so what we're seeing here is a mask of a type that Picasso could have seen in multiple examples. Again, I'm not saying he saw this exact mask. But you see what's interesting is the decorative elements above the forehead, the angled or protruding eyebrows, the deep set but abstract looking sort of semicircles for eyes, the flattened sort of architectural nose, the angled cheekbones, the lip, the open mouth, and perhaps the tongue that sticks out. Here, again, the geometricization of the human head in the form of an African mask. This is a Likuala mask, L-I-K-U-A-L-A, L-I-K-U-A-L-A, either from Gabon or the Democratic Republic of Congo. Extraordinarily abstracted here. Keep in mind that the mask would have been part of a whole ritual or ceremony. It's not an independent element. One can even see some of the holes in the side of the mask where some kind of material would have been attached. So the mask would have had more elements attached to it. It was probably used in a dance ritual. Very abstract-looking geometric eyes, again, that kind of architectural flattened nose, and an extraordinary sort of mouth that sticks out below. African sculpture had been discovered earlier on in the century among some of the Fauve artists. So it wasn't something that was brand new, although it was something that Picasso was really starting to notice. We know that Matisse was familiar with African sculpture by 1906, and it's probably Henri Matisse who showed some African sculpture to Picasso. and Picasso was supposedly quite struck by what he saw as a very original conceptual approach to the representation of the human head and the human face. The African masks are, as I have described them, composed in terms of geometric units and are very much abstracted, even though we recognize them and we can read them as heads and faces. They are abstracted from the tradition of the way a head and face is represented in Western European art. As opposed to Western European tradition, African sculpture is more conceptual. That is, it expresses the ideas and traditions of the tribe through the sculpture rather than imitating nature. So if this is meant to imitate a deity of some sort who takes part in a dance for transformation, he becomes abstracted, and this is the way we see him. Inevitably, if it is to express a concept within the tribe, this will lead to greater simplification and stylization of form. And it is quite typical in African art to see not only characteristic parts of the face or the head, but even parts of the body emphasized over other parts of the body because they are considered more important. So if the top part of the head is larger, or even the head itself is larger in relation to the body, it's because the African artist and the tribal tradition says the head is more important than the rest of the body. If the penis is larger, that's because the importance of fertility is being emphasized there. So if it's important, then conceptually you want to bring attention to it. You want to change it somehow. One of the elements that Picasso seems to have picked up from his study of African sculpture in this period are the lines or striations on the bodies themselves. And I'm referring specifically to striations or marks, linear marks, that one finds in African sculpture on the face, on the upper torso. In this case, we're looking on the left-hand side at a Senufo statue from West Africa, S-E-N-U-F-O, Senufo, in which when you are initiated into this particular, you could call it a club, but it's a cult within the tribe. When you become a member, a part of the membership is to go through this initiation ritual, and you actually have your body, it's not tattooing, but tattooing, of course, is very important in some cultures because it shows that you are a part, you have been initiated into a particular part of that culture. It's actually scarification. It's cutting the skin and then putting something into the cuts to keep it open until it can heal, so that it makes a really good scar. It's not allowed to heal easily. But the scars become quite large, and they're actually, in many cases, keloids. And we're seeing that represented in terms of the scarification on the breasts of this figure and even around the abdomen and the belly button. So I want you to look back at the Picasso figures, and you will see the kinds of lines that we're seeing here clearly been picked up from what he has observed of this traditional African scarification. But Les Demoiselles d'Avignon cannot be fully explained in terms of all of these traditional Western approaches to painting or from outside influences. It is truly a very unique and revolutionary painting because Picasso has begun to experiment with really a rejection of Renaissance perspective. Now, I know I hope you're arguing in your mind, well, no, wait a minute. What about Cézanne? What about some of the other post-impressionists who were doing something like this, using ambiguity, not allowing us to read the painting in the traditional Renaissance window on reality? Well, Picasso, one might say, has gone even farther. And it's particularly true if you look at the three figures on the left-hand side. And I'll have something to say about the squatting figure on the right as well. What you're seeing in Picasso is a kind of true optical synthesis. It's as if the painter has decided, I'm not going to stand here while my model stands there, and then from one point of view, show that figure, all right? What I'm going to do now is take my model, and that's why I needed a chair. This is the model. And I'm going to turn it around. And I'm going to look at it from multiple points of view. And I'm going to put those multiple points of view down in my work of art. So literally, look, I didn't drop that on my head, literally, you are getting more information about the subject than you've ever gotten before, because he's turned it upside down and backwards. Does that make sense to begin to understand Cubism? It's like it's no one's shaking their head. It's more about the actual reality of the entire model, the entire subject of the painting. The painter has moved freely. He has gathered information from multiple angles and viewpoints and perspectives. He has pulled them apart and put them back together again. The bodies of the figures on the left-hand side seem to be created from a single viewpoint. So that's helpful, certainly. This looks like a pretty much a straight profile view, right? And yet we can see certain parts of the body seem to have been manipulated or twisted. The same with this figure between the two on the left-hand side. A frontal view, but again, a kind of awkward twisting and turning, and certain ambiguities that are very difficult to begin to understand. For instance, if she's standing, where's the rest of her leg going? Where is it? And how is she standing if this leg is bent and the foot is off the ground? All right, so that becomes very problematic for us. There's a kind of tension established. In the figure in pure profile, is she wearing some kind of drapery? Because the drapery, what appears to be part of a robe over her right shoulder, is so close to the color, the skin tone, and seems to be so similar in terms of the outline of form to the figure herself that it becomes somewhat ambiguous in the reading. If we follow her arm down here, the inside of the arm, we come to what we read as the front buttock, right? Is that how you're reading it? So if this is the front buttock, then this must be the front leg, okay? But if that's the front leg, then where's the other leg? Because we could continue the buttock down and the other leg could be behind this cloth because we don't actually see the other leg. So which leg is in front? Where is the other leg? In the squatting figure on the right-hand side, you can take photographs to your heart's content in MoMA in New York of Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, but you are forbidden to photograph Guernica, which is in the Reina Sofia Museum in Madrid. So in any case, a lot of good images because I was able to get up close here. We have a squatting figure, and the subject is basically posed in a three-quarter view. Here's the buttock. Here's the leg coming out. Here's this arm. I cannot come down all the way. And then the left arm seems to come down and is splayed out. Okay, this is more than any yoga position, I have to tell you. And we read that this is the buttock because it's round. I'll take you back to the full image and you can see it. And because you notice under the left arm, we can see a little bit of the breast. See it there underneath? And that's the back. But then, how is it we have a frontal face on a back? So it's like The Exorcist. The head is turned all the way around. So in terms of traditional vision, this work manipulates and gives us multiple optical impressions of reality. Again, more information than has ever been offered to us before in any painting. There is furthermore no clearly readable sense of rational space here. The space is ambiguous. It's not based on linear perspective. In fact, we intuit that they are in an interior space. For whatever reasons you want to intuit that. Maybe from the evidence of seeing them seemingly perhaps inside of a room with some draperies, perhaps with some furniture. I remind you that originally there was a tabletop and a still life in the front, so that would seem to be to tell us they are inside. But where are they inside? And one of the issues here is that the figures are closely grouped together and so intimately related to their surroundings because the surrounding geometric shapes are very similar to the shapes that we see repeated in the bodies. So simultaneously, the foreground becomes the background and the background becomes the foreground. Picasso said that art is a lie that makes us realize truth. That quote will not be on the test. He eventually rejected the idea of an absolute visual truth and spoke of essential truth in his conception of the world. He also said the academic gospel of beauty is a fraud. So basically he's saying what the academy teaches is a fraud. Despite the fact that Picasso's art had evolved out of very traditional classical academic training. So let's back up. Pablo Picasso was born in Malaga on the coast of southern Spain, as I said, in 1881. Malaga, M-A-L-A-G-A. He had two sisters. His father's name was Jose Ruiz Blasco, and he was an artist and a teacher as well as a museum curator. So one might say his father was his earliest teacher. He would eventually take his mother's family name, Picasso, but he is known as Pablo Ruiz from his father, Picasso. Picasso's father specialized in painting birds, especially pigeons, and in the family home they had cages of pigeons. Birds would become a recurrent motif in Picasso's work. This, extraordinarily enough, you can see his name, Pablo Ruiz, is a drawing which he did at 9 years of age of some doves at Malaga. His family moved when he was 10 years old to an Atlantic seaport in Spain, and he started painting in earnest. He's 13 years old when he paints this work, The Head of a Man. He passes the entrance exam for the Art Academy in Barcelona at the age of 13. And we have some sketches and studies from this period, 1895 to 97 approximately, drawings that indicate that his early training, as with that of French academic painters, as we saw at the beginning of this course, is based on studying classical work, specifically working from casts. in order to attain the ability to work with value contrast and therefore three-dimensional form. So he's working with a reproduction of the Venus de Milo, as you can see, and then other classical statues. The one in the middle is actually derived from one of the surviving works from the Parthenon. So this is what he's producing at about the age of 14. Working from the live model as well. Some of these clearly are from the live model. In 1896, he painted the First Communion, a religious painting, entered in an exhibition in Barcelona in 1896. It shows a young woman, as the title implies, at her First Communion. It is a work which indicates a facility already at the age of 14 or 15 to emulate any kind of surface or surface texture, to create a three-dimensional space. And I think most interesting for a young artist who was so precocious, and this is true in music as well. Very often you get someone who's just brilliant, but they don't yet have that sort of mature old soul to really reach to the depths of understanding, to understand the personality, to understand the feelings, the emotions. But Picasso already had that. This is a portrait of his mother, Dona Maria Picasso Lopez. The date is 1896, and it is incredibly empathetic for someone who is so young. At 15, he won honorable mention at the Periodic National Exhibition of Fine Arts in Madrid. It's a photograph of him at the time. He submitted a work called Science and Charity, 1897, a painting of a sick woman attended by Science and Charity. Science is the doctor, Charity is the nun who is holding on to her child. In 1897, financed by an uncle, Picasso was sent to study at the finest art academy in Spain, the Royal Academy of San Fernando in Madrid. Francisco Goya had been the head of the Royal Academy of San Fernando in Madrid. And now Picasso is attending that same academy. He stopped going to classes because he said they were too conservative and there was nothing they could teach him. But he did visit the Prado often, and it is said that he copied some of the great masters in the Prado. He became totally entranced with the work of Diego Velázquez. And I do not have copies, but it is said that he made 2 or 3 copies of Velázquez's works at this time, portraits of Philip IV of Spain, and you cannot tell them apart. Now, I don't have them with me, but that's what I am told about them. He made copies. They look like Velázquez. In the spring of 1898, he came down with scarlet fever, spent a few months recovering, and then he returned to Barcelona and became deeply involved with the avant-garde artists and writers who met nightly at a tavern called El Quatre Gat. I will spell that for you, but that's what you're looking at. It's still there in Barcelona. It is the most fun restaurant bar. It is called E-L-S, Quatre, Q-U-A-T-R-E, Gat, G-A-T-S. And in this part of Spain, in Catalonia, they speak Catalan, so that's actually Catalan. It's not exactly Spanish, and it translates the 4 cats. What I love about it is, on the right-hand side, I'm showing you a Picasso poster to advertise El Quatre Gat. It's from 1899. If you look at the back, it's the same building. I mean, it gives you goosebumps. In February of 1900, Picasso had his first exhibition at El Quatre-Gâtes and his first favorable critical notices. He was 19 years old. If you could point to any influence on him at this time in this poster, what stylistic influence would it be?
Fauvism?
Sorry? Not exactly, and it's a little early still. This is 1899. So it's really not color that we're talking about. So if you've looked at the Captivate lecture on Art Nouveau, this is definitely Art Nouveau influence that we're seeing here. Finally, in 1900, with a friend, he went to Paris for the first time. The first oil painting he did there was a subject of Parisian nightlife. It's called Moulin de la Galette. Interestingly enough, Auguste Renoir had also painted Moulin de la Galette, but he made it a daytime subject and a kind of celebration of very wholesome-looking young Parisians. This is a little more ominous in the way the figures are represented. It's a less innocent world. It's a world more similar to that portrayed by Toulouse-Lautrec, who is also represented in the lecture on Art Nouveau. So you need to look at that if you haven't done it already. Picasso's style in Paris remained derivative because he was looking at everything, at the Impressionists, at the Post-Impressionists, at the Symbolists. So, for instance, these are some works from around 1901. On the left-hand side, the prostitute with a hand on her shoulder, and on the right-hand side, the harlequin. A harlequin is a name for a clown. Harlequin, the harlequin. So what have we got going on here? We've got Neo-Impressionism. We've got a little bit of Seurat. We've got Post-Impressionism. We've got some Cézanne going on over here on the right-hand side. It's really interesting the way he seems to absorb it and then kind of spit it out. He learns it so quickly. This man was Picasso's first dealer in Paris, Pedro Magnac. The influence here seems to be both from Art Nouveau and maybe from Gauguin. In the bright, flat areas of color outlined in black. We could even say this is Picasso's synthetist work. Magnac eventually introduced Picasso to another dealer, Ambrose Vollard, V-O-L-L-A-R-D, V-O-L-L-A-R-D, who gave the 19-year-old Picasso a show along with another Spanish painter. And what the critics noticed about this show, now in 1901, is that his works were quite derivative. In other words, he had been borrowing and using other sources. Finally, in the fall of 1901, all of that sort of derivative experimentation, that brightness of color, gave way to what can be considered the first original period of Pablo Picasso, often called the blue period because the predominance of the color blue in his palette. The simplest explanation for the use of this color and what in essence are some very depressing, some very sad images was the death of his best friend who had accompanied him to Paris. And the fact that he was also quite poor. He would often be as destitute as some of the people he painted. He felt alienated, he probably was frightened, he was far from home, and he painted people such as the sleepy drinker or the absinthe drinker here in 1902. Unable to sell his paintings, he finally left for Barcelona, and except for a brief trip to Paris, he remained in Spain until 1904. There he continued to paint pictures of lone figures against backgrounds that were increasingly simplified and flattened and compressed in space. He created this work called La Vie, or Life, in 1903. It's part of this whole series of works of his blue period. An important work because, again, it's not simply one figure, but a number of figures brought together in a kind of narrative. What looks like perhaps young lovers, or the mother and child represented on the right-hand side. So he's making a statement about the cycles of life, none of which look particularly happy here in the way that he represents them. In some ways, this representation of this young man is a reflection both of his friend who died and certainly of himself. Finally, in the spring of 1904, Picasso decided to settle in Paris permanently. He moved into a small room at number 13, Rue Ravignan. Today, it's on the Place Émile Goudot. The original building where he lived burned down in the 1970s, just as it was about to be preserved. So number 13 is no longer, it's not the same building. But, if you're a Picasso worshiper, you go and show up there anyway, and you stare at the building. Eventually, he began selling some works. He met the first young woman who over time would be a series of muses, of women who would inspire him in his painting. This is Fernande Olivier. She would remain with him as his mistress for 9 years. Fernande Olivier, Olivier. This is a photograph of Picasso from 1904. His mood lightens. He begins to introduce warm colors into his works, although the works themselves remain somewhat melancholy. This is the start of the so-called Rose period, beginning in around 1905. This is the Harlequin's family with Monkey. One of the cheapest forms of entertainment in Paris at the turn of the century and into the early 20th century was the circus. And so there is the influence of circus people and circus animals in some of the paintings at this time, such as this work. The culmination of all of his so-called circus paintings of this Rose period, as is referred to, is the work called The Family of Saltimbanque. The Family of Saltimbanque. A family of circus people. This is one of the largest paintings that he had painted to this time. It's about 7 feet square. In it, he assembled many of the characters whom he had, in essence, represented singly in other works, including the Harlequin, who dressed in that sort of diamond-decorated clown costume, which is recognized as a self-portrait of Picasso in profile. There are other figures, part of the family, but they seem to be hardly communicating with one another. It's a kind of strange interaction, if one can say that any kind of interaction is going on. I suppose it is, in the sense that they are grouped close together, but they don't seem to kind of look at each other, aside perhaps from this man, rather rotund, who looks at the younger man who looks away. They are represented in what looks like a desert landscape, a sort of moon-like landscape. There is an horizon in the distance. We do see the sky and the earth. But again, it's not any kind of traditional perspective or any kind of traditional landscape that he sets up for us. And there's an interesting, if one can say, detail, because she's so prominent. And that's the woman on the right-hand front of the painting. She is actually a Spanish provincial woman sitting beside a picture and wearing perhaps the kind of hat and dress that would be found in Catalonia, in the region of Barcelona, which he probably missed very much. In 1906, still painting, still trying to make his way, Pablo Picasso was 25 years old, and he was given a commission from an American expatriate, and her name was Gertrude Stein. So if you've seen Woody Allen's latest movie, Midnight in Paris, it's really a really fun takeoff on this time period, and it actually mixes time periods with different artists and writers. Who's the actress who plays Gertrude Stein? She's really wonderful. But anyway, it's you would agree it's a good movie, yeah. So here she is. Gertrude Stein's family was a very wealthy family from San Francisco, from California. But she had left California. She was living in Paris. She was herself a writer, but she was also a kind of mentor for a number of writers and artists in Paris at this time. She also, because of her family, was able to live well in Paris, to have salons, to invite artists and writers in, and she got to know Picasso, and she commissioned him to paint her portrait. It is said that the portrait went unfinished after she had posed for him about 80 times. He said that he could not capture her face. So he had done just about everything else, couldn't capture her face. Here she is on the right-hand side because I wanted you to decide if he ultimately did capture her face. He left the work unfinished, and he and Fernand went to Spain for the summer. And when he came back, he went to see the Iberian sculptures in the Louvre. It was like a light bulb went on. He was fascinated by those severely simple figures, those sculptures which I showed you just a moment ago, which also influence a couple of the figures in Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. And soon after reconsidering the portrait, he painted her with an Iberian head face, which in fact rather looks like her. And soon after that, he painted a self-portrait, in part also based on this new fascination with Iberian sculpture. And within the year, you can see this is 1906, he began studies for Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. Any questions to this point? Les Demoiselles d'Avignon is a work that has been described as the 20th century painting which conclusively and decisively rejected the idea of a Renaissance window on reality. We have looked at some of its precedents, some of its forebearers, but we've also talked about it as an extraordinarily original work in the context of the early 20th century. There is all kinds of experimentation and manipulation of pictorial space that is original, in a sense, with Picasso, that is unprecedented. What is fascinating in regard to the discussion that we've had thus far in analyzing the work from a formalist approach, in other words, talking about it more from the way he has manipulated all of the formal elements of the composition, is that one could argue that the work is not exactly the first Cubist painting. It has been described instead as, quote, the traumatic rupture that enables Cubism to begin. The traumatic rupture that enables Cubism to begin. And you'll see what I mean when we look at works that come out of Picasso's great experiment. The development of Cubism, and indeed the origins of the name for the movement, bring us to the study of a different artist, not Picasso, but Georges Braque. This is a photograph of Georges Braque in his studio in 1910. Georges Braque met Picasso in 1907 and was among those who saw Les Demoiselles d'Avignon in Picasso's studio. Braque had come to Paris to be apprenticed as, believe it or not, a house painter. He turned to fine art and he even exhibited with the Fauves. In fact, if we look at some of his earliest work, it's clearly related to the influence of Fauvism, which, you remember, was born in 1905. This is 1907, Countryside at La Ciotat. Perhaps, well, I don't know if I can even say it's a little bit looser in terms of the application of paint than the Fauvists. I think probably I shouldn't say that because you could argue with me that Matisse was doing the same kind of thing earlier on. The color, as in a Matisse Fauvist work or the Fauvist works of other artists working in this period, is highly subjective, wildly decorative. We know from his own statements and his own writings that Braque was at first very negative about Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. Yet almost immediately after seeing the painting in December of 1907, he began to work on this work, the large nude, or La Bagneuse. It was completed in 1908. The work is about 4 feet 9 inches in height, so this was a major work by Braque. And the debt to Picasso, in terms of the formal approach to the representation of the female form, is quite obvious. The distortion of the figure, the treatment of the background in terms of large angular planes that seem to almost integrate with or be part of the foreground and the figure itself. He capitalized on the element of ambiguity in Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, so that, for instance, you'll notice, again, that little play with the buttock. So if we follow the spine down, we're going to read this as the front buttock, yes? And this is the rear buttock. But again, suddenly the rear buttock becomes the front buttock attached to the front leg. So again, playing with us in terms of an effort to show as much of the figure as possible and create this ambiguity in so doing. Perhaps of equal importance to the development of Cubism are the landscapes that Braque painted at L'Estaque in the south of France in 1908. L'Estaque is a region where Cézanne used to paint. And Braque had been strongly influenced by looking at Cézanne. Indeed, the influence of Cézanne on contemporary painting was renewed and strengthened by a retrospective exhibition at the Salon d'Automne, at the Autumn Salon of Cézanne's work in 1907. Artists like Braque were looking at Cézanne's work especially how strong the work was structurally, the way he built his works. They were very different if you simply look back to what the Impressionists were doing. And remember, even Cézanne said he was trying to create an art of the museums. He was trying to recreate nature and work away from the kind of dissolving of form in nature that he saw in Impressionist painting. This is what Braque sees in Cézanne as well. This is his work called Houses at l'Estaque from 1908. In this landscape, we see an artist who is trying to deal with Cézanne. You can see that the landscape and the houses have been geometricized, that he has combined elements of the foreground, the middle ground, and the background, while still retaining, and again, we're lucky we have 20/12 eyes, retaining some sense of three-dimensionality. We can move in and around the tilting planes that simultaneously describe volume and, on the other hand, look flat. You see he's restricted his palette here, which is something Cézanne did as well. He had a certain number of colors he used, both warm and cool, and Braque is doing something very similar, restricting his palette to green, gray, ochre, and brown. He returned to Paris in the fall of 1908, and he submitted 6 of these paintings from L'Estaque to the Autumn Salon. The jury included Henri Matisse, and believe it or not, it's only 1908, the works were rejected. In a subsequent showing of the landscapes from L'Estaque, a gallery owner and critic termed Braque's paintings cubism or cubist. The critics remarked that the paintings were full of petits cubes. They were full of little cubes. And the name cubism comes from Georges Braque's painting, not from Picasso's. By late 1908, realizing that they were moving in a very similar direction in terms of the spirit of experimentation and rethinking nature, Picasso and Braque decided to collaborate. So that from approximately 1909 to 1911, they basically worked almost side by side, concentrating on still life paintings and 3/4 length figures. They restricted themselves in order to concentrate on a formal new vocabulary of painting, and that vocabulary was to define cubism. It was a period of about 2 years, 1909 to 1911, and it's often referred to as the first major phase of cubism. That first major phase, 1909 to 1911, culminating in these works of 1911, is called analytical cubism. So this is a sub-period of cubism, analytical cubism. The name is used to emphasize the degree to which objects and figures are analyzed from multiple points of view, as we saw Picasso doing initially in Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, but then taking all of those pieces and breaking them down and further dissecting them. And then, after you get hundreds of pieces, putting it back together again. By 1911, Picasso and Braque had been working together so closely that they had reached the same point of synthesis. And they didn't sign many of these works between 1909 and 1911. I think today we know who is the author of most of them, but in fact you can see how extraordinarily similar their styles have become. They have dedicated themselves to a common cause, and that is to paint figures that are fused with their surroundings. to paint paintings that indicate and emphasize the importance of both the space and the form or the object, to unify them, in essence, to create a new kind of visual picture surface. So on the left-hand side, I show you The Accordionist by Pablo Picasso, and on the right-hand side, The Portuguese by Georges Braque, both 1911. Notice that the palette has been severely reduced down to grays, browns, and greens and ochres. They do not want to be concerned at this point with color. Color is a whole other issue. They want to just use this basic palette of colors. They typically will choose a single figure. And again, we have 2012 eyes, but you could have 1911 eyes and still realize that even though they have melded foreground, middle ground, and background, you do see that there is a figure here, right? And you see that there is a figure because there's more going on as you get closer to the center of the painting. Both of these are vertical compositions. So you get much more angularity, smaller planes, more detail, more action areas. The same is true with the Braque here on the right-hand side. And clearly we can tell, even though they're melded, that there is a background. And the background is seen because as we get closer to the borders of the painting, it's quite clear that what we're talking about is a traditional kind of background. So to talk about these works as having some traditional elements is not that far-fetched. They have also dismissed a single light source. They choose light, and they choose to lighten or darken as they see fit within the painting. So far has analytical cubism come in both works that only vestiges of reality can be discerned. But it can be discerned. You can see the face of the figure here. You can see fingers, the main part of the body here. And the same with this figure who's actually playing a musical instrument. You can see the body of the instrument, some of the strings, the opening. So this is some sort of a guitar that he's holding and playing. We also see that Braque is teasing us with both the three-dimensional aspect of painting as an illusion and the two-dimensional flatness of painting, because he's actually used some stenciled letters on the back of his painting, and that will tend to flatten it right away. It's almost like a poster in the way he's used some of these very simple printers, stencils, right on the surface of the canvas. While Picasso and Braque were experimenting in the analytical phase, Cubism was gaining some very enthusiastic audiences. The works of both men were being exhibited at the Gallery of the Dealer, Daniel Henry Kahnweiler, whom I'm sure you recognize here, in an analytical cubist portrait by Pablo Picasso. The dealer is represented in a frontal view using the same technique that we saw in the earlier works, a 3/4 length and somewhat monochromatic. We see his hair nicely combed back. We see his eyes and his face, the main part of his body, and his hands that look like they're brought together and sort of clasped one over the other. Kahnweiler wrote an early theoretical explanation of Cubist aesthetics in a book called The Rise of Cubism, published in 1920. Slightly earlier interpretations and writings about Cubism emphasize the incorporation of multiple perspectives, emphasize that Cubism was a style that was born to be part of a modern urban life. And there's certainly some truth to all of this. And it is true that from the beginning of this class, I've approached an understanding of works of art from both a formalist point of view. In other words, why do we see the compositions the way we see them? In many cases, it's because that's what was taught and that's what the expectation was of the artist. But we also, aside from the formalist approach to representation, there's another approach to understanding works of art within an historical context. And a lot of new work has been done to try to place Cubism within that context. Because the argument has been made for years that these Cubist works have no specific relationship to the historical context, that these two men are completely sort of isolated in their studios and they're creating sort of the purest form of painting. But that really isn't true. In many of Picasso's works, in particular, there is historical context that is quite apparent. And the emphasis on historical context and describing that context in art history is usually referred to as a Marxist approach. A Marxist approach. Yes, from Karl Marx. In other words, that art results from the social and economic situation of those who produce it. The Marxist approach is absolutely not concerned with any formal issues. In fact, a Marxist art historian doesn't even have to look at the work of art. He can simply talk about it in the historical context, the ideology, the social and economic conditions. Marxists ask questions like, who was the patron? That will help you understand the art. You don't have to formally analyze it. What was the social status of the artist and the relationship of the artist to the patron? Why are certain elements present and what significance do they have? In other words, every subject has some sort of significance. If it's a prostitute, that's significant in terms of what the artist has chosen to paint. What ideologies on the part of the patron, the painter, the society shaped this work of art? Where was this painting shown? Who saw it? What influence did it have? What medium did the artist choose? That will tell you the significance of the work. You don't really have to be concerned with the formal approach to representation. I'm talking about this now in terms of modern art because increasingly the works that we're going to look at are going to become complex in terms of theoretical applications on the part of both the critics and, of course, the artists. We saw this already in Germany in terms of German Expressionism, that those were not just sort of gut-feeling paintings that were coming out. They were based in theory of the time. So I want you to keep in mind that there are multiple theoretical perspectives that help us understand a work of art in context, and that becomes increasingly important for us to point out. In the work by by Braque that we were just looking at, the Portuguese, he actually did introduce something that was brand new into analytical cubism. And as I said, those was the stenciled letters and some numerals as well. Braque described this subject as an immigrant on the bridge of a boat with the harbor in the distance. So I don't know about you, but one of the things I see is where the boat can moor, you need a nice strong rope, right? And you throw the rope around the mooring element. I'm sorry, I've forgotten what that's called. So, this is the dock that's here. This looks like an anchor. I don't know if we get some more sense of water. So there are these little clues here, certainly. But the lettering, I think, is the most remarkable. Bal is French for dance, and probably was suggested by a dance hall poster that Braque had seen. But this isn't a poster. This is an oil painting in the tradition of oil painting in France from the modern period, from where we started. The addition of letters emphasizes, as I said before, the two-dimensional aspect of painting. So again, it's a kind of slap in the face to the Renaissance idea of painting as an extension of a window on reality. The increasing experimentation at this time in the development of Cubist painting foretells the introduction of collage. Now, you thought that collage always existed, but in fact, collage was invented by the Cubists. In May of 1912, Picasso painted some paper and a section of commercially printed oilcloth onto a canvas that was in essence then a still life painting. This is considered the very first collage. The introduction of collage marks the beginning of the end of the first phase of formal cubism, analytical cubism, and begins a phase called synthetic cubism. And we'll take up with that on Wednesday.